Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the entrance of the official party. Thank you.
O naunai ka halame ka lewa e halelehua no ya na ka noi o ka uno ia e ano ia ne e ali ane o io tai timai ai timai noi ai tipuno me te aloha aloha e aloha e aloha e.
Aloha and Ekomo Mai. Welcome to the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. We welcome you in the tradition that acknowledges and honors the culture of the native custodians of our islands. Honored guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, and fellows of Comprehensive Security Cooperation Course 24-2. Allow me to introduce our guest speaker for today. His Excellency, the Honorable Dr. Kevin Rudd, AC, is Australia's ambassador to the United States of America, taking up his post in Washington in March of 2023. Ambassador Rudd served as Australia's 26th Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010, and then Minister for Foreign Affairs before a second term as Prime Minister in 2013. Since leaving government, Ambassador Rudd has resided in the United States, where he is recognized as a leading China analyst. In 2015, he became the inaugural president of the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York City. In 2020, he was appointed president and CEO of the Asia Society globally. And in 2022, he founded the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. In 2019, Ambassador Rudd was appointed a companion of the Order of Australia for eminent service to Indigenous reconciliation, innovative economic initiatives and major policy reform, and through senior advisory roles with international organizations. And we note that given Ambassador Rudd's interest in Australia's First Nations people, he and Australia's ambassador for First Nations people are also attending the Festival of Pacific Arts and Culture, which opens this evening here in Honolulu. Ambassador Rudd holds honorary positions at the Atlantic Council and the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., the Asia Society, Schwarzman Scholars, and Bloomberg New Economy Forum in New York, the Polson Institute in Chicago, the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris, France, the Chancellor Helmut Schmidt Foundation in Hamburg, Germany, and the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House in Canberra. He is founder and co-chair of an Australian charity, the National Apology Foundation, and a trustee of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. Ambassador Rudd started his diplomatic career in 1981 with postings in Beijing and Stockholm. In 1988, he was appointed Chief of Staff to the Honorable Wayne Goss and served him as Premier of Queensland. He was Director General of the Cabinet Office in Queensland from 1991 to 1995 and Senior China Consultant for KPMG from 1996 to 1998. This is Ambassador Rudd's second visit to Honolulu since being appointed ambassador to the United States. His second speech in a series on deterrence he is delivering this year, the first of which was delivered at the United States Naval Academy in April and is available online. And Honolulu is also a place personally very close to Ambassador Rudd's heart, as he spent his honeymoon here with Trace in 1981. So it's fitting on this day when we are reminded of the tremendous cost of conflict that we at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies are reminded of the vision of our namesake, who earned our nation's highest honor in that war 8 decades ago. Senator Inouye's appeal to us was to come together to discuss matters of common interest, common concerns, and come up with solutions and mutual understandings. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Rudd as he challenges our assumptions and broadens our understanding of our complex and consequential region with his remarks on the United States, China, and Taiwan, and the role of deterrence in scenarios short of war. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much for the very warm welcome. It's great to be back in Honolulu. My wife is not with me on this occasion. Think of us on our first diplomatic posting to Stockholm in Sweden in the middle of a Scandinavian winter, and our honeymoon was here in Waikiki. Frankly, our bodies have never recovered from the shell shock of then arriving in a blizzard in Stockholm, having spent a wonderful week here in Hawaii. Can I also say how glad I am to be here at this center, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. And thank you for your work in having a series of conversations, dialogues, and engagements, often on difficult questions affecting the long-term strategic stability of our common region. To members of the Consular Corps, greetings to my colleagues. Great to have you here. I can see some here from Korea and Japan, and I'm sure they're here from elsewhere as well. And thank you for the work you do in partnership with the United States government in dealing with our common challenges as well. And for representatives of Indo-Pacific Command, those who are joining us here today, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, looking at the photograph of myself so closely, I should have had a decent shave before I had it taken. So my wife would be horrified. But there's never enough time in public life. On this, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, as we honor the greatest generation, let us all acknowledge afresh the price of freedom everywhere, whether it's in the Atlantic, whether it's here in the Pacific. And here, in particular, in Hawaii, now the home of Indo-Pacific Command, where freedom's price has also been paid in the greatest of measures. The price of freedom remains eternal vigilance, just as the price of freedom remains continuing deterrence. The United States, China, and Taiwan have a deep and common interest in avoiding open military confrontation on the future of Taiwan, which The Economist magazine described recently as the most dangerous place on earth. That's because the risks of the general escalation of any such confrontation into all-out war over the future of the island are very great indeed. Furthermore, the economic costs, domestic political impacts, and unknowable geostrategic consequences that such a war would generate would likely be of an order of magnitude that we have not seen since the Second World War. In other words, whatever the outcome, an American victory, a Chinese victory, or a bloody stalemate, the world is likely to become a radically different place after such a war than it was before. And that of itself should induce great caution on the part of all strategic decision makers. That is why 2 years ago, before going back into government, I wrote a book entitled The Avoidable War. And it's why, in large part, I accepted our Prime Minister's invitation to come to Washington last year as Australia's ambassador to make a small contribution to the big challenges we all now face. I also acknowledge the important work done by analysts here in Honolulu, in DC, and around the world, both in and out of government, on the Taiwan challenge. Much of our collective focus has been on how to deter China from launching a full-scale military invasion to take Taiwan by force. There has been less attention, however, on the question of what the literature now generally describes as scenarios short of war. Their cumulative impact on our common objective of preserving the status quo across the Taiwan Strait, and the role of deterrence in responding to that including deterring escalation. What follows are some personal reflections on this important question for us all, doing so in my capacity as a China scholar and not as an official representative of the Australian government. While all three parties, the US, China, and Taiwan, might share a common interest in avoiding a catastrophic war over Taiwan, the underlying reality is that each is driven by different interests on how to achieve this within the framework of their wider national objectives. Let's look first at the United States. For the US, its core national interest lies in the retention of its global strategic primacy, militarily, economically, and technologically. It also seeks to remain at the fulcrum of the global political, economic, and wider multilateral system. In doing so, the US seeks explicitly to respond to what it identifies as the pacing challenge and most consequential strategic competitor, both regionally and globally, namely China. It also seeks more broadly to maintain the efficacy of the US-led international rules-based order, particularly when challenged by the fundamental assaults on that order, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as other threats to peace, stability, and security, such as we currently see in the Middle East. Furthermore, there is a growing recognition across the United States administration that the US can no longer sustain the rules-based global framework that upholds its interests alone, that it must increasingly do so in partnership with its treaty allies and other strategic partners around the world. Specifically applied to Taiwan, the US is committed to retaining the status quo. For the US, this is anchored in its three communiques with Beijing: the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, which guarantees US arms sales to the island to secure its long-term defense, and the so-called Six Assurances from the United States, when President Reagan reaffirmed to Taipei that this act, that's the Taiwan Relations Act, would not change, that there would be no end date for these arms sales, that the PRC would not be consulted on them, that the US would not seek to play a role in any mediation effort between the PRC and Taiwan, and there would be no change in the US's position over Taiwan, and that the US would not pressure Taiwan to enter into negotiations with the PRC. More particularly, the US does not support an independent Taiwan, while maintaining a posture of strategic ambiguity on the question of whether or not it would militarily defend Taiwan in order to encourage restraint on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. At the same time, the US recognizes that if China successfully militarily annexed Taiwan, it would have an immediate, profound, and potentially irreversible effect on the perceived reliability of US alliances around the world, together with the wider political credibility of the United States as a future global actor. These are the underlying reasons why, for the United States, the psychology and physical machinery of military deterrence and the military and industrial capacity to fight and win a war initiated by China across the Taiwan Straits if deterrence was to fail, with both of these elements underpinned by the political will to do so, why these three things are so fundamental to future strategic stability. These are the essential elements of an effective deterrence strategy. Operationalizing these represents the day-to-day challenge confronting America's political, strategic, and military leadership. These are lonely, difficult, and conceptually challenging jobs. We should all recognize that. They are materially relevant to all US allies and strategic partners, irrespective of their geography, given the global consequences that are at stake, therefore requiring our collective engagement. Just as they remain critical for the wider international community, given their collective interest in sustaining regional and global strategic stability in a world which has long forgotten what it would be like to navigate and survive a genuinely global war. Effective deterrence, therefore, remains essential business for us all in preserving our precarious peace. What about Taiwan? As for Taiwan, as a new and vibrant democracy where much remains politically contested, it's sometimes difficult for Taipei to define with precision its own core and continuing interests. However, at least over the past decade or so, despite all the sound and fury of Taiwanese domestic politics, a number of common principles emerge from the political noise. First, the Taiwanese people have now on 3 successive occasions voted for a government which rejects political unification with the mainland. Second, when we look at Taiwan's 3 major political parties, while some are more ambiguous than others, none of them now advocate a specific model of unification. Third, Taiwan's governing party, the historically pro-independence Democratic Progress Party, the DPP, has now embraced a policy committed to maintaining the status quo on Taiwan's current political status. That is, no longer moving towards any form of de jure independence, while at the same time rejecting any form of political unity with the mainland, claiming that in reality Taiwan effectively operates already as an independent entity. Fourth, Taiwanese public opinion, as measured through polls, also now overwhelmingly supports maintaining the status quo. 91% in a poll last year, rejecting both the extreme positions of independence on the one hand or unification on the other. Whatever their preferences may be for Taiwanese domestic politics, or whatever type of economy, society, and environment they may want on the home front. And finally, Taiwanese public opinion polls, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, indicate a rising public commitment to defend Taiwan if attacked, hovering between 65 and 75% of the population in recent years, higher than that of Ukraine before the Russian invasion. At the same time, polls in the last year show most Taiwanese are still skeptical as to whether China would ever attack, although less skeptical since Ukraine, as well as having a divided view on whether the US would in the end come to Taiwan's military aid in that event, with only 50% believing the US would militarily intervene. All these factors have given rise to the Taiwanese administration's decision to begin the process of increasing its defense budget after decades of attrition, modernizing its military capabilities and reforming its military doctrine to deal with the possibility of unilateral Chinese military action, including reintroducing military conscription, enhancing its cyber defense and wider economic resilience, as well as rebuilding Taiwan's civil defense. Taken together, these point to Taipei seeking to avoid Chinese red lines on its future political status, while at the same time recognizing that this of itself will be insufficient for Beijing's demand to see substantive progress on unification. Hence Taiwan's belated recognition of the need to build its own national deterrence capabilities, although not as rapidly as the United States would like. So what of China? Xi Jinping, of course, rejects Taiwan's approach, as recently articulated in his hardline political and military response to President Lai's inauguration on the 20th of May. It's important, however, to remember that apart from unification with Taiwan, Xi also has a large number of other major national objectives he sees the need to prosecute, although we would be foolish to diminish the significance he continues to attach to the reunification project. Xi's other priorities include the following: the political durability of his own regime and his own personal hold on power, now amidst a slowing economy. Second, maintaining overall national unity against the wider forces of separatism. Third, continuing to grow the economy while maintaining ideological and political control over the private sector. Fourth, reducing environmental damage, pollution, and climate change given their impact on the underlying social contract within China itself. 5, expanding and modernizing the Chinese military to meet multiple future contingencies, not just Taiwan. 6, managing China's 14 neighboring states to make them politically compliant and economically dependent on Beijing. 7, extending China's maritime periphery to the east to push the United States back to the third island chain if they can. 7, extending China's continental periphery to its west to maintain a benign relationship with Russia, Central Asia, and Central Europe, where China would be the dominant power. 8, leveraging the Belt and Road and other such initiatives to entrench Chinese trade, investment, and foreign policy power and influence across the Global South. And finally, with the support of the Global South, reform the norms, values, and institutions of the international system in a direction more compatible with Chinese interests and values, in a manner which seeks to invalidate the role of US alliance structures in global security, to legitimize a new form of state capitalist development model as opposed to the Washington Consensus, and to undermine the idea of universal civil and political rights as defined in the 1948 Universal Declaration, in favor of culture-specific rights that do not challenge the power of the state. Xi's Taiwan strategy is anchored within several of these core enduring interests, but not in all of them. Xi has nonetheless been relatively plain about his intentions on Taiwan. He has stated clearly what he describes as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, 中华民族伟大复兴, that it cannot be achieved without unification with Taiwan. He has also said that national rejuvenation is to be achieved by 2049, which means that, at least according to Xi Jinping, we're all now on a 25-year glide path to that destination. In 2015, Xi launched a military reform and modernization campaign to make the People's Liberation Army by 2027 into a world-class fighting force capable of fighting and winning wars, with a new set of Taiwan-focused military regions, a new capacity for joint operations, and a new fully informationized warfare doctrine. Since 2022, China has also changed its long-standing military exercise patterns so that PLA Air Force violations of the median line in the Taiwan Straits and Taiwan's claimed air defense identification zone have now become more routine and more numerous, together with repeated naval drills around the north, south, west, and in a new development to the east of the island as well. Then there is the question of China's grey zone activities against Taiwanese offshore islands, their surrounding seas and maritime assets, where China is using its Coast Guard against Taiwanese vessels, impeding the operational space for the Taiwanese Coast Guard and incrementally asserting China's sovereignty claims. Xi has made plain that he would prefer to secure Taiwan's unification by a combination of peaceful political means, reinforced by economic rewards and punishments, and a relentless campaign of political, economic, and diplomatic pressure. But if this approach fails, as is likely given the underlying condition of Taiwanese public opinion, Xi has made it clear that the military option would still be on the table to unify Taiwan by force. In other words, Xi's Taiwan strategy is relatively clear, although his more detailed timetable, of course, is far from clear. This is where we are all left to speculate. On this, we would be unwise, however, to ignore the question of Xi's own sense of personal and political mortality as someone who turns 71 years old this month. Indeed, it's not unreasonable to assume that Xi wishes to emulate Mao by achieving final national reunification while he is still active in political office. Then he is more likely to seek to do so in the decade ahead against that logic. In other words, before he finds himself in his 80s. Xi's political rhetoric directed towards Taiwan has also subtly changed during his first decade in office. The high point was perhaps 2015 and his meeting in Singapore with then President Ma Ying-jeou of Taiwan, when Xi stressed only the so-called 1992 consensus as the basis for progress on reunification. Now, however, Xi Jinping insists that Taiwan's leaders explicitly accept Beijing's one China principle and one country, two systems as the formula. Furthermore, while China has always decried Taiwanese independence, Xi has expanded the definition of what that means by now saying that China will not tolerate incremental independence. That's 渐进台独. On top of these subtle rhetorical shifts, China's military posture has also changed. Indeed, we would be foolish to ignore the increasing clarity of China's military signaling, including the pattern of its most recent military exercises in Joint Sword 2024A following the May inauguration. The fact that this exercise was called A also suggests that China is planning on B and possibly C and possibly D sometime later this year and perhaps into next year as well. Joint Sword 2024A was designated and designed to simulate a blockade of the island and, according to Beijing, quote, to punish, unquote, the Taiwanese for their democratic choice at their elections. It built on two earlier exercises: Joint Sword, the exercise that followed former President Tsai Ing-wen's April 2023 transit of the United States, and the unnamed military exercise that followed then US Speaker Nancy Pelosi's August 2022 visit to Taiwan, which was the first time the PLA practiced encirclement drills around the island. Both the 2022 and 2023 exercises simulated a blockade and also included live fire components designed to simulate an attack and invasion. Xi Jinping's accumulating military capacity and his political intentionality to take Taiwan by force, if he judges he can, is therefore relatively clear. But it is equally clear that Xi would prefer to achieve his political objective by non-military means. What remains unclear is how much Xi's overall risk calculus is determined by what he perceives to be the deterrent effect, warfighting capabilities, and political intentionalities of the US, Taiwan, and US allies. As I've written before, Xi Jinping might be a risk taker. He is a calculated risk taker, however, rather than a reckless risk taker. That is why a central question for our time, if we are to avoid war across the Taiwan Straits, is to understand how Xi Jinping actually interprets the deterrent strategies of the US, Taiwan itself, and US allies and strategic partners. Second, what therefore constitutes the optimal content of what the US now calls its overarching strategy of integrated deterrence towards Taiwan? And third, how these combined considerations play out in Xi's overall calculus, given the range of other national interests he's also required to calibrate. In April this year, I sought an lecturer at the US Naval Academy in Annapolis to define what is meant by this broad framework of integrated deterrence. In my Annapolis lecture, I listed the various components of an effective integrated deterrence strategy, at least as seen from an Antipodean lens. Each is complex in its own right. However, together they do constitute a strategy. They were these. The first was clarity in communication to the Chinese leadership that neither the US nor Taiwan have any interest in changing the status quo in terms of Taiwan's international political personality, thereby avoiding long-standing Chinese red lines on independence. This should be accompanied by a parallel clarity of communication that the US and its allies have no interest in changing the political status quo in China itself, notwithstanding China's Marxist-Leninist system, as this is a matter for the Chinese people themselves. This represents a broader red line for Beijing, although not directly, only indirectly linked to Taiwan. Second, in terms of an integrated deterrence strategy, the capacity of the Taiwanese administration, military and civilian population to fight, to degrade an incoming Chinese force in the Air Sea Gap, to retard its advance on the island itself, and mindful of Ukrainian precedents to retain political control, all in order to provide an effective first line of deterrence. Third, the power and predominance of the US military across all 5 warfighting domains to convey an effective deterrent message to Beijing over Taiwan, and for deterrence to be credible, the US military's capacity to fight and win if deterrence fails. Fourth, the political will of any future United States administration and Congress to use its military for these purposes. Fifth, the particular role of nuclear deterrence, given China's decision to expand its nuclear force and to potentially abandon its long-standing doctrine of non-first use. Six, the financial, economic, trade, investment, and US dollar dimensions of integrated deterrence, and the capacity of these to impose both perceived and actual costs on the Chinese system in the event of unilateral military action. 7, the rapidly unfolding technological dimension of deterrence, particularly in AI and its impact on an increasingly integrated civilian and military battle space. 8, the foreign policy aspects of deterrence in the eyes of the rest of the international community, particularly given the potential human and economic cost of any future Chinese military invasion of Taiwan and its impact, therefore, on international public opinion, including across the global south. 9, the role of US allies and strategic partners in the operationalization of integrated deterrence. And finally, and parallel to the overall deterrence equation, is how Xi Jinping views each of these elements and how he assesses them both in aggregate and in the context of his other national priorities. In this, we also need to be particularly mindful of not simply mirror imaging or projecting onto the CCP by automatically projecting onto the Chinese leadership what we assume should and therefore would be Beijing's response to a given set of deterrent actions, rather than what those reactions would actually look like in practice. This is arguably the hardest part of the effective deterrence question, but it is by no means impossible to make judgments about. Here in Honolulu, the home of Indo-Pacific Command, it's been my pleasure to spend the morning with friends and colleagues at Indo-Pacific Command. I hope to look at the first of these elements, namely the extent to which we can assess whether Taiwanese and American assurances on Taiwan's future political status are having any moderating or deterrent effect on China's posture towards the island. And if not, what strategy is China now embarking upon, short of preparation of an actual invasion, to achieve its political objectives in relation to Taiwan? And what is the role of deterrence in responding to this grey zone strategy, this strategy of short of war, being short of invasion? What therefore do we mean by maintaining the status quo? The key to Beijing's red line on Taiwan's political status is China's fear that Taiwan will become an independent state and be effectively recognized as such by the international community, thereby destroying the possibility of future unification with the mainland. This in turn is based on Beijing's insistence that any political dialogue between Taiwan and the mainland must be based on the so-called 1992 consensus, an ambiguous arrangement with a complex textual history, broadly based on the principle of one China, albeit with differing interpretations of what that means to each side. Because the DPP, unlike the KMT, remain opposed to the one China element within the 1992 consensus, Beijing has rejected all official dialogue with the Taiwanese administration since 2016. The DPP's 1999 resolution on the future of Taiwan and subsequent statements have said that Taiwan was already independent, and so it no longer had any need formally to declare itself as independent. President Tsai Ing-wen took this concept further, continuing to reject the 1992 consensus while now conceptualizing the DPP's position on Taiwan status as one of continuing to maintain the status quo, 保护现状. This position has been sustained by President William Lai in his 20 May inauguration speech. For those of us who seek stability across the Taiwan Strait, that is welcome. It stays well within China's formal red line. But at a different level, Beijing has made plain to foreign interlocutors that avoiding a formal and active independence is not sufficient. What is necessary in Beijing's view is progress towards unification through negotiations based on Xi's re-articulation of the 1992 consensus, its precondition for any negotiations to take place at all. Or, as other Chinese government representatives have made plain, maintaining the status quo might sound acceptable to the United States, but it is unacceptable to Beijing, as China perceives Taiwan's ongoing and growing autonomy to be intolerable. In other words, far from being relieved that the DPP some time ago stepped back from the brink of any formal declaration of independence, Beijing is signalling loud and clear that its political objectives remains to force Taiwan into negotiations on its preferred one country, two systems formula, the one that it used for Hong Kong. It's important that the international community understands that while William Lai has uttered the magic words, maintain the status quo, 保护现状, and has also made reference to the Republic of China Constitution, the 中华民国宪法, as the underpinning legal framework for his presidency, of itself also important from Beijing's one China policy perspective, but these two things, these two forms of language, do not satisfy the PRC. Indeed, given the continuing impasse over the 1992 consensus, Beijing will conclude that Taiwanese self-perceptions of its autonomous status and international perceptions of the same will become irrevocably entrenched. If this is so, and now that Beijing's main hope, the KMT, has lost yet another election, and as time, from the China's perspective at least, begins to run out, we are beginning to see a change in Chinese strategy towards what it defines as the Taiwan problem. That does not necessarily mean preparation for an imminent invasion, given the extraordinary risks that such action would entail, although such contingencies can never be ruled out. Rather, it's more likely to explain the growing recourse to a multi-dimensional grey zone strategy over the past 18 months or more, aimed at applying new forms of pressure on Taiwanese international public opinion to force Taipei to the negotiating table. For these reasons, we should not assume that China is somehow locked into a static strategy on Taiwan. Indeed, the evidence suggests that while China's strategic objective is constant, its tactical approach is increasingly dynamic. And this explains in part the recent and rapid increase in multidimensional grey zone pressure being applied to Taiwan. This also appears to be the assessment of William Lai himself, who stated in his inauguration address that China's military actions and grey zone coercion are considered the greatest strategic challenges to global peace and stability, unquote. Importantly, there is nothing preventing an accelerating multidimensional grey zone strategy from folding into a broader blockade or even military invasion if grey zone measures fail to procure the desired political end state in Taiwan itself. In an important article recently by two of America's foremost China-Taiwan analysts, Jude Blanchette and Bonnie Glaser, a grey zone is defined as, and I quote them, the contested arena that lies between routine statecraft and open warfare, in which an actor probes for advantage and gains without crossing a threshold that results in open war, unquote. Blanchette and Glaser go on to argue that, quote, the simplest way to conceptualize it is as a political strategy that seeks economic, military, diplomatic, or political gains without eliciting a costly and direct response from the opponent, unquote. There are also other related terms of art in this area, such as measures entitled short of war or short of invasion, as used recently by a landmark study on China and Taiwan by a team led by Dan Blumenthal from the American Enterprise Institute and the Institute of War Studies. All three of these authors point to an emerging combination of political, military, diplomatic, economic, and cyber measures, where the objective is to achieve a psychological, attitudinal, and behavioral change on the part of the Taiwanese public and political opinion. According to the authors, these include intensifying political assaults by Beijing to delegitimize Taiwanese political leaders opposed to unification. They include intensifying naval, air, coast guard, and other intrusions across the median line, across Taiwan's 24-mile contiguous zone, and in and around Taiwan's offshore islands to demonstrate that the Taiwanese administration, in the eyes of its people, is increasingly incapable of sustaining and managing Taiwan's claim to sovereignty. They embrace punitive economic measures, well short of a blockade, aimed at impeding Taiwanese trade, investment, and other national income generating activities, and in cost of living sensitive areas, in order to demonstrate to the broader, more apolitical Taiwanese voting public their vulnerability to coercive measures of this type. During her own recent tenure, President Tsai Ing-wen already pointed to mounting cyber intrusions into Taiwan's economic and communications infrastructure, again with the intention of demonstrating to the Taiwanese people their acute vulnerability to systems collapse against an integrated cyber attack. Diplomatically, China's existing and successful approach of rapidly reducing the number of Taiwan's diplomatic partners around the world from 21 down to 12 in just 8 years will continue. as will Beijing's vigilance in seeking to reduce Taiwan's international space, including its involvement in multilateral forums such as the World Health Assembly. A further example of this strategy of political and diplomatic isolation is China's efforts since its 2022 Taiwan White Paper to increasingly conflate its One China principle with UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 of 1971. This was the resolution which switched the PRC's accession to the China seat at the UN in place of what the UN then described as the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek, although the resolution made no explicit reference to Taiwan's status or indeed the Republic of China on Taiwan. China is therefore seeking to use Resolution 2758 to resolve for itself and for all time and with all its partners the international legal status of Taiwan as being part of China, consistent with Beijing's interpretation of the One China principle. Given China's growing political constituency across the global south, the UN is providing a useful forum for Beijing to leverage this argument more widely across the international community. Indeed, China's defense minister again made reference to this in his remarks to the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore last week. This is generating new momentum in China's efforts to constrain Taiwan's ability to engage other multilateral institutions, as well as its ability to expand its bilateral engagements with other states. China's wider purpose appears to be to advance a broader claim in international law that because Taiwan is part of China, Beijing can therefore use any range of measures in the future to respond to what it might define as secessionist or insurrectionist activities. Beyond these growing challenges to Taiwan's political status, Blanchette and Glaser also point to targeted disinformation and psychological warfare campaigns aimed at the US-Taiwan relationship in particular. They refer to the following as examples, and I quote them. Chinese spokesperson Zhu Fenglian claimed that the United States was preparing to abandon Taiwan after turning it into a minefield and into an ammunition depot. Still another narrative held that the United States is seeking to provoke a war in the Taiwan Strait in order to protect its regional influence from growing Chinese power, and that Taiwan should be wary of becoming American cannon fodder. This messaging campaign is facilitating the spread of American skepticism, 以美国论, doubting America, and on accompanying decline in belief that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense as measured in a number of recent Taiwanese opinion polls, unquote. For those of us who have followed Chinese short of war or grey zone strategies in both the South and East China Seas, there are some similarities in this approach. Japan has seen this with the intensity of PLA Air Force sorties around Senkaku Diaoyuda. We have also seen China assert non-lethal coercive actions in relation to the Second Thomas Shoal with the Philippines. With Taiwan, however, there appears to be a growing intensity across the full range of grey zone activities. The question for the international community is how to respond to this rapidly unfolding change in China's Taiwan strategy. China's grey zone measures are likely to intensify beyond those which we have seen so far, given the recent re-election of the DPP. That is not to say that China has somehow suspended its efforts to build the military capabilities necessary to take Taiwan in the future by using overwhelming military force if it chose to. In fact, those efforts continue. But there is no incompatibility between these two approaches from China's perspective. China's political strategy for unification with Taiwan has always had a military component. Indeed, these two approaches are entirely compatible. If the cumulative effect of a sustained multidimensional grey zone campaign against Taiwan is to reduce Taiwan's deterrence and warfighting capabilities, as well as its political, social, and economic resilience, which is also a core part of Taiwan's overall deterrence equation. In terms of a wider strategy of integrated deterrence on the part of the US and its allies, our common aim is preserving the status quo across the Taiwan Strait as part of a wider objective of sustaining long-term strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Deterring China from launching military action against Taiwan is the cornerstone of this strategy. The question that therefore arises for all of us is where to locate within the wider framework of integrated deterrence China's emerging menu of strategic measures that remain short of war and short of invasion, but which will share the same political objective, which is to force Taipei to capitulate. The AEI IWS report of April 2024 offers one detailed study of the emerging shape of what it describes as China's possible course of action over the 4-year period lying ahead, leading up to the 2028 Taiwanese elections, which in their view constitute the next major political inflection point. The study also points to a range of policy recommendations for the US, Taiwan, and others in responding to such a strategy, as well as how to deter the further intensification of this strategy by drawing a clear linkage between identifiable grey zone actions on the one hand and a series of calibrated policy responses on the other, rather than no responses at all, which presumably is Beijing's current expectation. These are matters on which governments across the region and the world are now increasingly engaging. Of course, if in the future the Taiwanese body politic chose of its own volition to engage in a fresh round of negotiations with Beijing on easing cross-strait tensions, on new forms of economic cooperation, and new approaches to the political relationship between both sides of the Taiwan Strait, that is entirely a matter for the Taiwanese people. Indeed, all of our interests would be served by breaking the 1992 consensus impasse so that effective dialogue can recommence after nearly a decade of silence. Silence accentuates tensions, talking can reduce it. Remember what Winston Churchill said, always better to jaw than to war. But there is a difference between a voluntary agreed approach to negotiations as opposed to a coerced one. And from Beijing's own perspective, there is also the salutary lesson that coercion rarely works in international relations. Indeed, it can produce the equal and opposite reaction to that which is sought as local populations literally rally around the flag and dig in even harder. To conclude, we live in what I call the decade of living dangerously. For Beijing, strategic reassurance that Taipei and its international partners will sustain the status quo in relation to Taiwan's political future, and in terms of Taiwan's political future status, it's essential for strategic stability. But with Xi Jinping's evident frustration at Taiwan's ongoing autonomy, this reassurance alone, while it is necessary, is not sufficient to preserve that stability. It needs to be part of a much wider equation of integrated deterrence, which will command all of our efforts for the decade ahead if we are indeed to successfully preserve the peace. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Again, please join me in thanking Ambassador Rutt for those insightful comments.